Billionaire Sheikh's card got declined. But what the maid's daughter did when she saw it shocked everyone. The Sheikh was a man of untouchable wealth, his name whispered in boardrooms from London to Tokyo. Yet one ordinary night, under the humming lights of a convenience store, everything changed. Declined. The machine flashed, and the room fell silent. A man behind him muttered, "Problem," while a teenager snickered, "Dressed like a king, but can't buy a bottle of water." And then, a small voice cut through the air, "I can pay for it." That moment, so small, almost laughable, would ignite a chain of events no one could have predicted. It wasn't about wealth, or power, or even pride. It was about something far greater. And what began as a moment of humiliation inside a dusty corner store would unravel into something no one could have predicted. This is the story of how one girl, with nothing but a wallet and a belief in kindness, changed the life of a man who thought he had everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. His world was built on gold, but in that moment, all he saw was red. The Sheikh, a man who could buy kingdoms, stood frozen as the machine declared him unworthy. A small girl with hair like spun sunlight watched him, her hand clutching a worn, leather wallet. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the convenience store hummed, a monotonous sound in the sudden, sharp silence. Sheikh Tariq al-Jamil, a name that echoed in the boardrooms of London, Tokyo, and New York, stared at the credit card reader. The word declined glowed with an impudent red, a color he usually only saw on the velvet interiors of his custom-built cars. A man behind him, his worn work boots smudged with dirt, shifted his weight. "Problem?" he asked, his voice rough around the edges. Tariq didn't turn. He was used to people speaking to him with a certain reverence, a hushed respect. This man's tone was flat, impatient. It was ordinary. And that was the problem. Tariq was not an ordinary man. He slid another card from his wallet, this one a sleek, black rectangle of metal, reserved for purchases that could fund a small nation. He tapped it on the reader with a flick of his wrist. Declined. The cashier, a young woman with a name tag that read Brenda, chewed on her lower lip. "Sir, I can try it again." "Don't bother," Tariq said, his voice a low growl. The accent, a smooth blend of Oxford English and soft Arabic, was usually enough to command attention. Here, it just seemed to make him more of a spectacle. A teenager further back in the line snickered. "Dude's dressed like a king, but can't buy a bottle of water." His friend chimed in. Maybe his camel's parked outside and it ate his cash. The laughter, though muffled, felt like a physical blow. Tariq's shoulders, usually ramrod straight, tensed. He was dressed in a bespoke suit, the fabric a whisper of silk and wool that cost more than the entire inventory of this sad little store. On his wrist, a watch ticked with the quiet precision of a Swiss master, its face a constellation of tiny diamonds. He was the epitome of wealth, of power, of a life lived beyond the reach of ordinary men. And he couldn't buy a simple bottle of water. "I can pay for it." The voice was small, high-pitched, and impossibly clear in the charged atmosphere. Tariq turned, his eyes slowly adjusting to the source of the sound. A little girl, no older than 10, stood beside him. Her hair was a cascade of messy blonde curls, and her eyes, the color of a summer sky, were fixed on him with a startling intensity. She was small, with scuffed knees and a faded t-shirt that had probably seen better days. In her outstretched hand, she held a worn, brown leather wallet. It was the kind of wallet a man might carry, creased with age and softened by years of use. Tariq stared at her, then at the wallet, a flicker of something unfamiliar, confusion, perhaps, in his dark eyes. "I don't need your money, child. But your cards don't work," she said, her logic simple and unassailable. "And you look thirsty." She pushed the wallet closer to him. "My mom says you should always help someone who needs it. It's what heroes do." A woman at the back of the line sighed dramatically. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Now the kid's trying to bail out the rich guy. This is better than television." Brenda, the cashier, looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Sir, do you want the water or not?" Tariq felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He should leave. He should walk out of this store, get back into his waiting limousine, and forget this ever happened. But he couldn't. The girl's unwavering gaze held him captive. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment. Just a simple, unadorned offer of help. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Abigail," she said. "But my mom calls me Abby." "Well, Abby," he said, crouching down to her level, the expensive fabric of his suit creasing. "That is a very kind offer. But I assure you, I can afford the water." "Then why is the machine saying no?" she asked, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Before Tarek could answer, a woman's voice cut through the air. "Abigail, there you are. I told you to wait for me by the magazines." A woman in a simple, clean maid's uniform hurried towards them. Her face was etched with worry, her hands twisting a corner of her apron. She looked at Tarek, her eyes widening at his expensive suit and the air of authority that clung to him like a second skin. Then she looked at her daughter and at the wallet in her hand. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She's not bothering you, is she?" "Not at all," Tarek said, his gaze still on Abby. "Your daughter was just offering me a loan." The woman, Susan, blushed. "Abby, put that away. That's your great-grandpa's wallet. You know you're not supposed to take it out." Abby clutched the wallet to her chest. "But he was a hero, Mom, and he would have helped." Susan looked from Tarek to her daughter, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and pride. I'm sorry, sir. My grandfather, he was a soldier, a war veteran. He taught us to always look out for people." Tarek stood up, his towering height seeming to fill the small space. He looked at the mother, at her worn-out shoes and her tired eyes, and then at the daughter, with her fierce loyalty and her simple, unwavering belief in doing the right thing. He had been surrounded by people his entire life, by assistants and advisors and bodyguards. But in that moment, in that cheap, brightly lit convenience store, he felt a loneliness so profound it almost stole his breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a money clip, peeling off a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to Brenda. "For the water," he said, his voice firm. "And for everyone else in the line. Whatever they're buying, it's on me." A murmur of surprise rippled through the line. The teenager who had mocked him now stared at him with wide eyes. Brenda took the money, her hand shaking slightly. Tarek then turned to Abby. He knelt down once more, his eyes meeting hers. "Your great-grandfather was a wise man," he said. "And you, little one, are a worthy heir to his legacy." He then stood, gave a slight nod to Susan, and walked out of the store without another word. The limousine, a long, black shadow against the setting sun, was waiting for him at the curb. As he slid into the plush leather seats, he could still feel the weight of the little girl's gaze, a gaze that had seen not a billionaire Sheikh, but just a man who was thirsty. And in that simple act of seeing, she had shown him a world he had long forgotten existed, a world where kindness was a currency more valuable than gold. He had come to this small, forgotten town to finalize a business deal, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition that would add another jewel to his already heavy crown. But as the limousine pulled away from the curb, leaving the convenience store and the little blonde girl behind, Tarek had a feeling that the most significant transaction of his life had just taken place, and it had cost him nothing at all. The car moved with a silent, electric grace, insulating him from the world outside. His driver, a stoic man named Franklin, kept his eyes on the road, betraying no awareness of the scene that had just unfolded. Tarek's phone buzzed on the seat beside him. It was his chief of staff, Marcus Thorne, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to ensuring Tarek's world ran without friction. "Sir," Marcus's voice was crisp, efficient. "The issue with your cards has been resolved. A security flag was triggered by the unusual location. It won't happen again." "Fine," Tarek said, his voice flat. He stared out the window at the passing landscape of small houses and dusty fields. It was a world away from the gleaming steel and glass towers of his usual domain. Also, a reminder that the final meeting with the Henderson family is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Their legal team sent over the final papers. "It's a standard closing. They've accepted our terms." "They had no choice," Tarek murmured. The Henderson farm was a sprawling piece of land, the last holdout against his company's plan to build a massive distribution hub. He had offered them a price that was, by all accounts, generous. But it wasn't about generosity. It was about acquisition. It was about winning. "Indeed, sir," Marcus said. "Old man Henderson is sentimental, but his sons are practical. They understand the value of progress. Progress. Tarek rolled the word around in his mind. He had always seen himself as an agent of progress, a man who built things, who created empires. But looking out at the fading light of the afternoon, he wondered what progress looked like to the people who lived in these small, quiet towns. Did it look like a distribution hub? Or did it look like a little girl offering her great-grandfather's wallet to a stranger? He ended the call without another word and leaned his head back against the cool leather. He was staying in a sprawling, modern mansion on the outskirts of town, a sterile glass box that had been rented for him, complete with a full staff that moved with the silent efficiency of ghosts. It was a place designed for a man like him, a place of isolation and quiet luxury. But for the first time in a long time, he found himself craving something else. He thought of the girl, Abby, of her clear, unafraid eyes, and of her mother, Susan, with her tired face and her quiet dignity. He had seen a flicker of something in her eyes as well, a fierce, protective love for her daughter that was as potent as any army. On a whim, he leaned forward. Franklin, turn the car around. Franklin glanced at him in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Sir, take me back to that convenience store. Franklin did as he was told, the big car executing a smooth, silent turn. A few minutes later, they were back in front of the store. The line was gone. The teenager and his friend were nowhere to be seen. It was just an ordinary store on an ordinary street. Tarek got out of the car, the evening air cool on his face. He walked into the store, the little bell above the door chiming softly. Brenda, the cashier, looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "I believe I left something here," Tarek said, his gaze sweeping the store. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew he wasn't ready to leave this place, this feeling, behind. And then he saw it. A small, stuffed rabbit, its fur a little worn, sitting on the floor by the magazine rack. He remembered Abby clutching it while she waited for her mother. He walked over and picked it up. It was a simple thing, probably bought for a few dollars at a store much like this one. But in his hand, it felt significant. He turned to Brenda. "The woman and her daughter who were here earlier, do you know them?" Brenda nodded. "Susan and Abby?" "Yeah, they live just a few blocks from here. Susan, she cleans houses, mostly for the rich folks up on the hill." She paused, then added, "She's a good person, works hard." Tarek looked down at the rabbit in his hand. "Thank you," he said. He paid for another bottle of water, this time with a $100 bill from his clip, and told her to keep the change. Then he walked out of the store and got back into the car. "Franklin," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I need you to find out where Susan and Abby live." The next morning, Tarek sat in his temporary mansion, the Henderson file open on the table in front of him. The numbers were clear, the projections solid. The deal was a masterpiece of corporate strategy, a move that would consolidate his power and add another billion to his net worth. But he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the convenience store, to the little girl with the blonde curls and the stuffed rabbit. He had sent one of his security team to the house Franklin had located. The man had returned with a simple report, a small, rented house in a modest neighborhood, a place where a woman who cleaned houses for a living would raise her daughter. Marcus called again, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Sir, the Hendersons are here. Their lawyer is with them. Are you ready?" Tarek looked at the file, at the cold, hard numbers that represented a family's legacy, a piece of land that had been in their name for generations. He thought of Old Man Henderson, the sentimental one, and his practical sons. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," he said. But instead of getting up, he picked up the stuffed rabbit from the table. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the worn fabric, the simple stitching. He thought of Abby's words. "My mom says you should always help someone who needs it. It's what heroes do." And then he made a decision. It was a decision that went against every instinct he had honed over a lifetime of ruthless business dealings. It was a decision that would make Marcus question his sanity. It was a decision that would cost him millions. But in that moment, it was the only decision that felt right. He stood up, leaving the Henderson file on the table. He walked out of the mansion, the stuffed rabbit in his hand, and got into the waiting limousine. "Where to, sir?" Franklin asked. "Take me to Susan and Abby's house," Tarek said. "And then, I have a new offer to make to the Hendersons." The Henderson farm wasn't just land. It was a living history of a family. Generations had been born and had died on that soil. Old Man Henderson, a man with hands as rough as tree bark and eyes the pale blue of a winter sky, had resisted Tarek's offers for months. Not because the money wasn't good, but because he couldn't imagine a world where that land didn't belong to his family. His sons, however, saw things differently. They saw the struggling farm, the mounting debts, the endless work for dwindling returns. They saw Tarek's offer as a lifeline, a chance to escape a legacy that had become a burden. When Tarek walked into the conference room, the tension was palpable. The Henderson sons, Mark and David, sat on one side of the long, polished table, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. Their lawyer, a slick man in a suit that was a size too small, fiddled with his pen. Old Man Henderson sat at the head of the table, his back ramrod straight, his expression grim. He looked at Tarek with a quiet disdain, the look of a man who has already lost everything that matters. Marcus stood by the window, his posture rigid. He gave Tarek a look that was a mixture of relief and stern disapproval. "Sir," he said, his voice a low hiss. "You're late." Tarek ignored him. He walked to the head of the table and sat down, placing the stuffed rabbit gently on the polished wood in front of him. The Henderson sons stared at it, then at Tarek, their confusion evident. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Sheikh Al-Jamil, we have the final papers here. If you'll just sign." Tarek held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at Old Man Henderson, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice calm and clear, "I have a new offer for you." Mark, the older son, spoke up. "A new offer? We've already agreed to your terms." "Your sons have agreed." Tarek corrected him gently. "You have not." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I am withdrawing my original offer." A stunned silence filled the room. The lawyer's pen clattered to the table. Mark and David exchanged panicked glances. Old Man Henderson's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, entered his eyes. Marcus stepped forward, his face pale. "Sir, may I have a word with you in private?" "That won't be necessary, Marcus," Tarek said, his voice firm. He turned his attention back to the Hendersons. "My new offer is this. I will not buy your farm." David, the younger son, found his voice. You can't do that. We have an agreement." "You have a piece of paper," Tarek said. "I am offering you something more valuable. I am offering you your legacy." He then laid out his new proposal. He would invest in their farm. He would provide the capital to modernize their equipment, to improve their irrigation, to hire the staff they needed to make the farm profitable again. He would help them set up a direct-to-market business, selling their organic produce to the high-end restaurants in the city. He would, in essence, become their partner, not their conqueror. And in return, he wanted a small percentage of the profits, enough to make it a sound investment. But more than that, he wanted them to set aside a portion of their land for a community trust, a place where local children could come to learn about farming, about nature, about the value of working the land. The room was silent as he spoke. The Henderson sons looked at him as if he had grown a second head. The lawyer stared, his mouth agape. Old Man Henderson, however, was looking at him with a new light in his eyes. The disdain was gone, replaced by a cautious, hesitant respect. When Tarek finished, the old man spoke, his voice raspy with emotion. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do this?" Tarek looked down at the stuffed rabbit on the table. He thought of a little girl with blonde hair and a worn leather wallet. He thought of a war veteran who taught his family to always look out for people. "Because," Tarek said, his voice barely a whisper, "I was reminded of the value of things that cannot be bought or sold." The deal was struck, not with a flurry of signatures, but with a simple, firm handshake between Tarek and Old Man Henderson. The sons, after a moment of stunned silence, slowly began to smile. The lawyer, still baffled, began to shuffle his papers, his carefully constructed world thrown into disarray. As Tarek left the room, Marcus fell into step beside him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sir, I must advise you, this is unorthodox. You're leaving millions on the table." "I'm gaining something far more valuable, Marcus," Tarek said. He then handed the stuffed rabbit to his chief of staff. "See that this is returned to its owner. Her name is Abigail. She lives on Elm Street." Marcus took the rabbit as if it were a live grenade. "Sir, and Marcus," Tarek added, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time that day. "Cancel my flight. I think I'll be staying in town for a while." He walked out into the bright morning sun, feeling a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He had come to this small town to conquer, to acquire, to win. But in the end, he had surrendered. And in that surrender, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a reason to build, not just an empire, but a better world, one small, forgotten farm at a time. Marcus Thorne felt utterly ridiculous. He, who had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals and navigated the treacherous waters of international finance, was standing on the porch of a small, slightly dilapidated house, holding a one-eyed, plush rabbit. The house needed a new coat of paint. A bicycle with a flat tire lay on its side in the patchy front yard. It was, in Marcus's estimation, a portrait of profound mediocrity. He smoothed down his tie and knocked on the door. It was opened a moment later by Susan, Abby's mother. She was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and wary. She looked from Marcus's immaculate suit to the limousine parked at the curb, a silent, black panther in the quiet suburban street. "Can I help you?" she asked, her hand resting on the doorframe, not quite inviting him in. "Miss Susan," Marcus began, his voice taking on the smooth, placating tone he used with difficult clients. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I work for Sheikh Tariq al-Jamil." Susan's expression tightened. A flicker of fear, or perhaps anger, crossed her face. "We don't want any trouble. My daughter was just trying to be kind." No, of course," Marcus said quickly, holding up the stuffed rabbit as if it were a peace offering. "There is no trouble. On the contrary, Sheikh al-Jamil was very touched by your daughter's gesture. He believes she may have left this in the convenience store yesterday." Susan stared at the rabbit, her eyes softening. Bun, she murmured. "Abby has been heartbroken. Thank you." She reached out and took the toy, her fingers brushing against Marcus's. Her hand was calloused, the hand of a woman who worked. "It was my pleasure," Marcus said, feeling an uncharacteristic pang of something he couldn't quite name. Pity? Respect? It was all very confusing. "The Sheikh also wanted me to give you this." He produced a thick envelope from his inner pocket. "He understands that a single mother's life can be challenging. He hopes this will be of some assistance." Susan looked at the envelope as if it were a snake. "I can't accept that. I assure you, it is given with the utmost respect," Marcus insisted. "There are no strings attached." "People like him always have strings," Susan said, her voice low and fierce. "Tell your boss we don't need his charity. We take care of our own." She clutched the stuffed rabbit tighter, as if it were a shield. Before Marcus could formulate a response, the door creaked open wider, and Abigail peeked out from behind her mother's legs. "Is that the man from the store?" she asked, her voice a bright, curious chirp. Susan put a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Go back inside, Abby." But Abby ignored her. She looked at Marcus, her blue eyes wide. "Did you tell the thirsty man thank you for buying everyone's stuff?" Marcus was taken aback. He had been prepared for suspicion, for greed, even for tears. He had not been prepared for the simple, unadorned gratitude of a child. He knows you are grateful," he stammered. "Good," Abby said, nodding seriously. "Mom says you always have to say thank you. It's what heroes do." She then disappeared back into the house, leaving Marcus standing on the porch, the thick envelope still in his hand, feeling more out of his depth than he ever had in a boardroom. Susan's expression was a complex mixture of pride and exasperation. She looked at Marcus, then at the envelope. "Please," she said, her voice softer now. "We can't. But you can thank him for us. For the rabbit." And with that, she closed the door, leaving Marcus alone on the porch with the rejected charity and the lingering scent of lemon-scented cleaning supplies. As he walked back to the limousine, he felt a grudging admiration for the woman. She had a spine of steel and a daughter who believed in heroes. Perhaps, he thought with a wry smile, this little town wasn't so mediocre after all. Tariq, meanwhile, was discovering a world he had only ever seen from the window of a private jet. He spent the next few days at the Henderson farm, not as a conqueror, but as a student. He traded his bespoke suits for jeans and a simple work shirt, his polished Italian shoes for a pair of sturdy boots. He walked the fields with Old Man Henderson, listening to the old man talk about the soil, the seasons, the delicate dance of sun and rain. He learned to mend a fence, to drive a tractor, to feel the satisfaction of a day's hard labor under a wide-open sky. The Henderson sons, Mark and David, watched him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They couldn't understand why a man who could buy the world would choose to spend his time fixing a broken irrigation pipe. But as the days passed, they saw the genuine interest in his eyes, the respect with which he listened to their father, and their suspicions slowly began to melt away, replaced by a grudging friendship. One afternoon, as Tarek was helping Old Man Henderson repair the roof of a barn, the old man paused, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a weathered hand. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I was wrong about you." Tarek stopped hammering, turning to look at the old man. "How so? I thought you were just another rich man, coming here to take what you could get. But you're not like that. You're a builder." He gestured to the fields, green and lush under the afternoon sun. "You're helping us rebuild this place. Our home." Tarek looked out at the rolling hills, at the neat rows of crops, at the farmhouse nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees. He thought of the glass and steel towers he had built, the monuments to his own ambition. They were impressive, certainly, but they were cold, sterile things. This place was alive. It had a heart, a soul. "I think," Tarek said, his voice quiet, "I am the one who is being rebuilt." That evening, as he sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple, a car pulled up the long, dusty driveway. It was Susan's car, an old, slightly battered station wagon. She got out, and Abby scrambled out after her, clutching Bun Bun, the stuffed rabbit. Susan walked towards the porch, her steps hesitant. She was holding a large, foil-covered dish. "Mr. Henderson said you were staying for dinner," she said, her voice a little shy. "I thought I'd contribute. It's just a casserole." Old Man Henderson, who had come out onto the porch, beamed at her. "Susan, my dear, you didn't have to do that. It's the least I could do," she said, her gaze flickering towards Tarek. "To thank you for everything." Abby, however, had no such reservations. She ran up the porch steps and stopped in front of Tarek, her eyes shining. "You're the thirsty man," she said, as if it were the most wonderful discovery in the world. Tarek smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes. "And you're the hero with the wallet," he replied. She held up the stuffed rabbit. "Thank you for finding Bun Bun. He was very scared." "I'm glad he's safe now," Tarek said, his voice soft. They ate dinner on the porch as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The food was simple, hearty, and delicious. The conversation was easy, flowing from stories of the farm to Abby's adventures in the 3rd grade. For the first time, Tarek saw Susan relax. He saw the worry lines around her eyes soften, heard the genuine warmth in her laughter. He learned that her great-grandfather, the war veteran, had been awarded a medal for bravery, for pulling 3 of his fellow soldiers out of a burning tank. He had come home from the war a hero, but had never spoken of it. Instead, he had poured all his energy into his family, into his community, teaching them the simple, profound lessons of courage, kindness, and looking out for one another. That worn leather wallet Abby carried was his, a tangible link to a legacy of quiet heroism. As the evening wound down, and Susan began to gather her things, Tarek walked with her to her car. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice low, "for my associate, Marcus. He was clumsy. I did not mean to offend you with my offer of money." Susan looked at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You didn't offend me," she said. "You just don't understand. We don't have much, but we have our pride. It's all we have, sometimes." "I am beginning to understand that," Tarek said, "and I respect it more than you can know." He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. "In my world," he said, his voice thoughtful, "pride is about acquisition, about power. Here, it seems to be about something else entirely. It's about knowing who you are," Susan said simply, "and what you stand for." She got into her car, and Abby waved to him from the passenger seat. He waved back, a strange ache in his chest. He watched them drive away, the red taillights of the old station wagon disappearing into the darkness. He stood there for a long time, listening to the chirping of the crickets and the rustle of the wind in the trees. He had come to this town a king, a man who believed he had everything. But as he stood on the porch of the Henderson farm, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, he realized he had been living in a very small, very empty kingdom. And a little girl with blonde hair and a hero's wallet had just shown him the way to a much larger, much richer world. News of Sheikh Tariq al-Jamil's strange new project traveled fast. In the boardrooms of his global empire, it was met with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. Whispers started to circulate. The Sheikh had lost his mind. He was having a breakdown. He was being manipulated by a bunch of simple-minded farmers. Marcus Thorne found himself in the unenviable position of having to field the frantic calls from board members and investors. He tried to reassure them, to spin the story as a savvy philanthropic venture, a PR move. But in his heart, he knew it was more than that. He had seen the look in Tariq's eyes, the quiet determination, the sense of purpose. The Sheikh wasn't losing his mind. He was finding it. The real trouble started when a man named Richard Sterling caught wind of the situation. Sterling was a ruthless corporate raider, a man who saw Tariq not as a rival, but as prey. He had been circling Tariq's company for years, looking for a weakness, an opening. And now he saw one. Sterling began to quietly buy up stock in Tariq's company, using shell corporations and back-channel deals. He planted stories in the financial press, painting Tariq as an eccentric, unstable leader who was squandering the company's resources on a sentimental pet project. The narrative was simple and effective. The king had abandoned his throne, and it was time for a new ruler. Back in the small town, Tariq was blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. His days were filled with the simple, satisfying rhythms of the farm. He had helped the Hendersons secure a contract with a chain of high-end organic grocery stores, and the first major harvest was just a few weeks away. The farm was coming back to life, and so was he. He had also found himself drawn more and more into the life of the town. He donated a significant sum to the local library, a place Abby loved. He sponsored the Little League baseball team. He became a regular at the local diner, where the waitresses knew his order by heart. He was no longer a spectacle, an outsider. He was becoming a part of the community. His friendship with Susan and Abby had deepened as well. They often had dinner together at the Henderson farm, or he would join them for a picnic in the park. He found himself captivated by Abby's endless curiosity, by her simple, profound wisdom. And he found himself drawn to Susan's quiet strength, her fierce independence, her unwavering moral compass. One sunny afternoon, he was helping Abby with a school project in the town square. They were building a model of the solar system out of styrofoam balls and wire. The sun is the biggest, because it's a star, Abby explained with the grave seriousness of a seasoned astronomer. And all the planets have to circle around it. It's called gravity. Tariq smiled. That's right. The sun is the center. It holds everything together. Like my mom, Abby said matter-of-factly. She's my gravity. Tariq looked over at Susan, who was sitting on a nearby bench, reading a book, a soft smile on her face. And in that moment, he felt a pull stronger than any business deal, more compelling than any acquisition. It was a feeling of belonging. The moment was shattered by the sharp ring of his phone. It was Marcus, his voice tight with urgency. Tariq, we have a problem. A big one. Marcus quickly laid out the situation. Sterling's hostile takeover bid. The plummeting stock prices. The panic among the investors. The empire Tariq had spent his life building was on the verge of crumbling. You need to come back, Marcus said, his voice pleading. You need to fight this. You need to remind them who you are. Tariq looked at the styrofoam solar system in his hands. He looked at Abby, her face clouded with concern. He looked at Susan, who was now watching him, her book forgotten. He had a choice to make. He could return to his world of glass and steel, to the battlefield of the boardroom, and fight to reclaim his throne. Or he could stay here, in this small, quiet town, in this world of simple truths and profound connections. He thought of what Susan had said. Pride is about knowing who you are and what you stand for. He knew who he was. He was a builder, and he knew what he stood for. He was no longer interested in building empires of gold. He wanted to build a world of kindness, of community, of quiet heroism. I'm not coming back, Marcus, he said, his voice firm. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Tariq, you can't be serious. You're just going to let him take everything. He can have the company, Tariq said. He can have the buildings, the jets, the money. It's just stuff. I have something far more valuable here. He ended the call, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. He had made his choice. He had let go of his kingdom. He walked over to Susan, his steps sure and steady. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice low and serious. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "What is it?" "I am no longer a billionaire," he said. A slow smile spread across Susan's face. "Good," she said. "You were never very good at it." And in that moment, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warm afternoon sun, Tariq al-Jamil, the man who had lost an empire, felt, for the first time in his life, like the richest man in the world. He had finally found his gravity. And it was here, in this small town, with this remarkable woman and her extraordinary daughter. The battle for his company was just beginning, but the battle for his soul had already been won. The news of Tariq's abdication hit the financial world like a seismic shock. For a few days, it was the only story that mattered. Pundits debated his sanity, rivals celebrated his downfall, and for a brief, dazzling moment, the small, unassuming town found itself in the international spotlight. Reporters descended, their satellite trucks lining the quiet streets, their cameras pointed at the diner, the convenience store, the Henderson farm, anywhere that might offer a glimpse of the eccentric ex-billionaire. But the town, in its quiet, stubborn way, closed ranks. The residents, who had come to see Tariq not as a sheikh, but as a neighbor, offered polite but firm no comments. Old man Henderson chased a particularly persistent journalist off his property with a rake. Brenda, at the convenience store, became an expert at smiling blankly. The story, lacking a fresh angle, quickly fizzled out. The world, with its short attention span, moved on. For Tariq, life became both simpler and infinitely more complex. The constant buzz of his phone was gone. The endless stream of reports and market analyses ceased. The weight of an empire was lifted from his shoulders, and in its place was a quiet sense of freedom he had never known. But there was also a gnawing uncertainty. He had defined himself by his wealth, his power, his ability to shape the world to his will. Who was he without it? He moved out of the sterile mansion and into a small, rented cottage on the edge of town, a place with a leaky faucet and a garden overrun with weeds. He used the last of his personal funds to settle his affairs, a process that was both humbling and liberating. He owned nothing but his clothes, a few books, and the pair of work boots he'd bought at the local hardware store. Susan and Abby were his anchors in this strange new reality. They helped him paint the cottage, their laughter echoing in the empty rooms. Abby, with a seriousness that belied her age, taught him how to plant a vegetable garden, showing him how to coax life from the soil. Susan, with her quiet, steady presence, taught him the value of a shared meal, of a simple conversation, of a life built not on grand gestures, but on small, everyday acts of kindness. One evening, as they sat on his porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly ballet, Tariq confessed his fears to her. "I feel adrift," he said, his voice low. "I spent my whole life building things. Now, I don't know what to build." Susan looked at him, her gaze clear and direct in the fading light. "Maybe," she said gently, "it's not about building things anymore. Maybe it's about tending to them." She gestured to the small garden, to the neat rows of tomato and cucumber plants. "You didn't build this garden. The seeds did that. You just gave them a place to grow." Her words settled in his heart, a simple truth that resonated more deeply than any corporate philosophy. He was no longer a king. He was a gardener. And that, he realized, was a far nobler calling. But the world he had left behind was not finished with him yet. A week later, a long, black car, even more ostentatious than the one Tariq had once used, rolled into town. It stopped in the town square, and a man in a perfectly tailored, sharp gray suit stepped out. He was tall, with slicked-back silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was Richard Sterling. He hadn't come alone. With him was a team of lawyers and developers, their faces hard, their briefcases full of contracts and blueprints. Sterling had not just taken over Tariq's company. He had absorbed its assets, its power, its ambition. And he had come to finish what Tariq had started. He called a town meeting. The old community hall was packed. Sterling stood at the podium, a picture of polished, predatory charm. He spoke of progress, of jobs, of a bright new future for the town. He unveiled a large, glossy artist's rendering of his vision, the Henderson farm, paved over, replaced by a massive, soulless distribution hub, exactly as Tariq had once planned. Sheikh al-Jamil had the right idea. Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescending magnanimity. He just lacked the will to see it through. He got sentimental. I, on the other hand, am a businessman. I understand that progress requires sacrifice. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Old man Henderson stood up, his voice shaking with a mixture of age and fury. That's not progress, Mr. Sterling. That's destruction. That's our home you're talking about paving over. Sterling's smile sharpened. It's my property now, Mr. Henderson. I bought the bank that holds your mortgage. A mortgage, I might add, that is significantly in arrears. The partnership you had with Sheikh Al-Jamil is null and void. The farm, the land, it all belongs to me. The color drained from Henderson's face. The room erupted in angry shouts. But Sterling was unmoved. He held up a hand, silencing the crowd. I am, however, a reasonable man, he said, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Tarek, who was standing in the back, his face a grim mask. I am prepared to offer the town a deal. A community benefits package. New roads, a new school. All I ask for in return is your cooperation. No protests. No legal challenges. A smooth, orderly transition. He paused, letting his words sink in. Or, you can fight me. And I assure you, you will lose. And then you will get nothing. He looked directly at Tarek, a triumphant smirk on his face. It's your choice. The path of sentiment, or the path of profit. Your former friend here chose sentiment. Look where it got him. The meeting ended in disarray. The town was divided. Some, swayed by Sterling's promises, saw the distribution hub as a necessary evil, a chance for jobs in a town that desperately needed them. Others, led by the Hendersons, saw it as a betrayal, a desecration of their way of life. Tarek found himself at the center of the storm. He had, inadvertently, brought this serpent into their garden. He felt a crushing weight of responsibility. He had lost his fortune, his company, his power. What could he possibly do now? That night, he sat on his porch, staring into the darkness, the angry, fearful voices from the town meeting echoing in his head. He had never felt more powerless. Susan found him there, a cup of tea in her hand. She sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. It's my fault, he said, his voice hoarse. I brought this on them. You brought them hope, Susan corrected him gently. You showed them a different way. That's not your fault. But I can't fight him, Tarek said, a note of despair in his voice. I have nothing. He is everything. Susan reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, steady. You're wrong, she said. He has money. He has power. But you have something he'll never have. What's that? He asked, looking at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes. You have us, she said. You have this town. And you have the truth on your side. She squeezed his hand. That's not nothing, Tarek. That's everything. Her words were like a spark in the darkness. He looked at his hands, no longer the soft, manicured hands of a billionaire, but the calloused, capable hands of a man who worked the land. He thought of the Hendersons, of their fierce love for their farm. He thought of Brenda at the convenience store, of the folks at the diner, of the entire town, a tapestry of ordinary people with extraordinary hearts. And he thought of Abby, of her simple, unwavering belief in heroes. A slow, determined fire began to burn in his chest. Sterling was right. This was a battle between two worlds, two sets of values. The world of sentiment versus the world of profit. And Tarek knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, which side he was on. He stood up, his back straight, his eyes clear. He wants a fight, he said, his voice low and steady. Then we'll give him one. He was no longer a king. He was no longer a billionaire. He was just a man, standing with his neighbors, ready to defend his home. And in that moment, he was more powerful than he had ever been. The war for the soul of the town had begun. The first shot was fired not with a gun, but with a sheaf of legal papers. Sterling's lawyers filed a motion to evict the Hendersons, citing the defaulted mortgage. A date was set. They had 30 days. The town seemed to hold its breath. The initial anger and defiance began to curdle into fear and resignation. How could they possibly fight a man like Sterling? He was a giant, and they were small. But Tarek had a plan. He had spent his life navigating the complex world of finance and law. He knew that giants, for all their strength, often had fragile ankles. He called a meeting, not in the community hall, but in the Hendersons' barn. The air was thick with the scent of hay and old wood. He stood before the gathered crowd, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, the heart and soul of the town, and laid out his strategy. "We cannot fight him on his terms," Tarek said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We cannot outspend him, but we can outsmart him, and we can outlast him." His plan was twofold. First, the legal battle. He had spent days in the town library, the one he had helped fund, poring over old maps and property records. And he had found something. A forgotten covenant in the original town charter, a clause that protected agricultural land from industrial development. It was a long shot, a legal loophole that Sterling's high-priced lawyers had overlooked in their haste. It wouldn't stop him forever, but it would buy them time. The second part of the plan was a battle for public opinion. "Sterling wants to paint us as sentimental fools, standing in the way of progress," Tarek said. "We need to show the world who we really are. We need to tell our story." And so they did. They launched a campaign, not with expensive ads, but with something far more powerful, their own voices. A young teacher started a blog, posting daily stories about the farm, about the town, about the lives that would be destroyed by Sterling's project. A local photographer, who usually shot weddings and high school portraits, began documenting the beauty of the landscape Sterling wanted to pave over. His photos, stark and beautiful, began to circulate online. Susan, who had a quiet, eloquent way with words, wrote a letter to the editor of the state newspaper. She didn't write about legal loopholes or economic impact. She wrote about her daughter, about the lessons of her great-grandfather, about a community that believed in looking out for one another. She wrote about a different kind of progress, one measured not in dollars, but in human decency. The story began to catch on. It was a classic David and Goliath tale, and people were drawn to it. Small donations started to trickle in, enough to hire a scrappy, idealistic young lawyer who was willing to take on their case pro bono. News crews, the same ones who had dismissed the town as a passing curiosity, began to return, this time with a different narrative. They were no longer covering the fall of a billionaire. They were covering the rise of a community. Sterling, insulated in his corporate headquarters, was enraged. He saw the growing resistance not as a genuine movement, but as a personal insult, a final act of defiance from the man he had deposed. He doubled down, filing more lawsuits, sending his lawyers to harass and intimidate the townspeople. The pressure was immense. People were scared. The 30-day eviction deadline loomed like a guillotine. But something had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a stubborn, resilient hope. They were no longer a collection of individuals. They were an army of gardeners, of shopkeepers, of teachers, an army led by an ex-billionaire with nothing to his name, but a fierce determination and a community that had his back. The day of the eviction hearing arrived. The small-town courthouse was overflowing. Tarek stood with the Hendersons, their young lawyer by their side, a mountain of paperwork on the table in front of them. On the other side of the aisle was Sterling's legal team, a phalanx of expensive suits and smug expressions. Sterling himself sat in the front row, a silent, imposing figure. He looked at Tarek, a look of cold, confident disdain in his eyes. He believed he had already won. He had the money, the power, the law on his side. But Tarek met his gaze without flinching. He had something Sterling didn't. He had a story to tell. A story of a town, of a farm, of a little girl who believed in heroes. And he was ready to tell it. The judge entered the courtroom, and a hush fell over the crowd. The battle for the soul of the town was about to reach its climax. Sterling's lawyer, a man whose name was as sharp and expensive as his suit, laid out their case with brutal efficiency. The facts were simple, he argued. A loan had been made. The loan was in default. The property, therefore, was forfeit. It was business, clean and uncomplicated. He presented documents, signed and sealed, that spoke a language of numbers and obligations, a language that left no room for sentiment. When it was their turn, the town's young lawyer, a woman named Sarah, stood up. Her suit was not as sharp, her voice not as practiced, but her eyes burned with a conviction that Sterling's lawyer lacked. She didn't dispute the mortgage. Instead, she spoke of history. She presented the town charter, its pages yellowed with age, and pointed to the covenant, a nearly forgotten promise made by the town's founders to preserve the integrity of the land for future generations. "This case is not about a loan, Your Honor," Sarah argued, her voice clear and steady. It's about a legacy. It's about whether a contract signed last month can erase a covenant made 200 years ago. It's about whether the definition of value is limited to what can be bought and sold. Sterling's lawyer scoffed, dismissing it as a desperate, romantic fantasy. But the judge, an older man with a weary but thoughtful face, leaned forward, his interest piqued. He allowed Sarah to proceed. The turning point came when Tariq was called to the stand. Sterling's lawyer was merciless. He painted Tariq as a failure, a fallen titan who had lost his nerve and was now leading a group of simple-minded townspeople on a futile crusade. "Mr. Al-Jamil," the lawyer said with a sneer, "you built an empire worth billions. You were a king of industry, and you gave it all up. Why? For a piece of dirt? For a child's fantasy about heroes?" Tariq met his gaze, his expression calm. "I did not give anything up," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "I simply traded one currency for another." When Sarah began her questioning, she didn't ask about business. She asked him to tell the court what had happened at the convenience store. And so, Tariq told them. He told them about the declined cards, about the humiliation, about the small girl with blonde hair who had offered him everything she had. In that moment, Tariq said, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom, landing for a moment on Abby, who sat between her mother and old man Henderson, "I realized that I, a man who could buy anything, was bankrupt in the ways that truly matter. That little girl, with her great-grandfather's wallet and her simple belief in kindness, was wealthier than I could ever hope to be." He spoke of the farm, not as an asset, but as a living thing, a place of history and hope. He spoke of the town, not as a demographic, but as a family. He was no longer speaking as a sheikh or a CEO. He was speaking as a neighbor. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When the arguments were finished, a deep silence fell over the courtroom. The judge looked at the stack of documents from Sterling's lawyers, then at the fragile, yellowed charter presented by Sarah. "This court acknowledges the legal standing of Mr. Sterling's claim regarding the mortgage," the judge said, his voice slow and deliberate. "The debt is real. However," he paused, his gaze resting on the townspeople, on their anxious, upturned faces. "This court also acknowledges that the law is not merely a collection of rules, but a reflection of a community's values. The covenant in the town charter, while old, speaks to a foundational value of this community, the preservation of its heritage." He declared that he was issuing a temporary injunction, halting the eviction. He was referring the case to the State Historical Preservation Committee, ordering a full review of the covenant's legal standing. The process would take months, perhaps even years. It wasn't a final victory, but it was a reprieve. It was a lifeline. A collective gasp of relief swept through the town's side of the courtroom. The Henderson sons hugged their father, tears streaming down their faces. Susan squeezed Tariq's hand, her own eyes shining. Sterling's face was a thundercloud. He stood up abruptly, his jaw tight with fury. He had been denied his swift, clean victory. He had been delayed, challenged, forced to acknowledge a power that couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. He shot Tariq a look of pure venom, then turned and stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers trailing in his wake like pilot fish. The townspeople spilled out onto the courthouse steps, their chatter and laughter filling the afternoon air. They had faced the giant, and he had not crushed them. For the first time, they truly believed they could win. Tariq stood apart from the celebration, watching the joy, feeling a profound sense of peace. He had lost an empire, but he had helped save a home. As Sterling was about to get into his waiting limousine, a small figure blocked his path. It was Abby. She said nothing, her small face serious, her blue eyes unwavering. She simply held out the worn, brown leather wallet. Sterling glared down at her. "What do you want, child? Get out of my way." "I think you need this," Abby said, her voice clear and small in the sudden quiet. "My great-grandpa was a hero. He said you have to be brave to be kind, especially to people who have forgotten how." Sterling stared at the wallet as if it were a scorpion. This was the source of it all. This ridiculous, sentimental object. This relic of a world he had long ago dismissed as weak and irrelevant. He looked from the wallet to the girl's face, a face devoid of fear or guile. She wasn't mocking him. She was offering him help. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling was utterly speechless. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who broke companies, who bent the world to his will. But he had no defense against this. No strategy for an enemy who met him not with anger, but with compassion. He didn't take the wallet. He simply stood there for a long moment, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. Then, without a word, he turned, got into his limousine, and was gone. The next morning, Sarah received a call. Sterling was withdrawing all legal action. He was selling the mortgage back to the Henderson family for the symbolic sum of $1. No explanation was offered. He simply surrendered. The town was in shock, then in jubilation. A victory party was held at the Henderson farm, a celebration that lasted long into the night. They had won. The giant had retreated. Amid the celebration, Tarek found a quiet moment on the porch with Susan and Abby. Abby was asleep in her mother's lap, her hand still clutching the old leather wallet. He just gave up, Tarek said, still struggling to comprehend it. Why? Susan looked down at her sleeping daughter. Because you can't defeat an idea, Tarek. And Abby, she's a very powerful idea. She smiled, a soft, warm smile that made Tarek's heart ache in the best possible way. She reminded him of something he'd lost. Maybe something he never had. 6 months later, the Henderson farm was transformed. New equipment, paid for by a consortium of ethical investors Tarek had connected them with, gleamed in the fields. The first harvest had been a record breaker. The plans for the community trust were laid out. A corner of the farm set aside for a place where children could come to learn, to grow, to get their hands dirty. The town was not just surviving, it was thriving. Tarek had found his purpose. He wasn't building an empire, he was tending a garden. He had become a partner in the farm, his business acumen now used to create sustainable growth, not ruthless acquisition. He and Susan were building a life together, their love a quiet, steady thing that had grown out of shared battles and simple truths. One day, a small, unassuming package arrived for him in the mail. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in a simple box, was a stock certificate. A single share in a newly formed company called Legacy Farms, a venture dedicated to supporting small, family-owned farms across the country. There was no note, but Tarek knew. It was a message from a world he had left behind, a quiet acknowledgement from a man who had been defeated not by power, but by a little girl with a hero's wallet. It was a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the seed of kindness Abby had planted had found fertile ground in the unlikeliest of places. That evening, as the sun set over the rolling hills, Tarek sat on the farmhouse porch with Susan and Abby. Abby was showing him a drawing she had made, a picture of the farm with a smiling sun, a man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands in the foreground. "This is us," she said, pointing with a crayon. "This is our home." Tarek pulled her into a hug, the scent of summer grass and childhood filling his senses. He looked at Susan over Abby's blonde head, her eyes reflecting the warm colors of the setting sun. He had come to this town a thirsty man, a king without a kingdom. And here, in the heart of this small, forgotten place, he had found everything he had ever been searching for. He had found his gravity. He had found his wealth. He had found his home. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.